Hello, so in today's video I want to talk about this camera, the Canon V1, which is a small point and shoot type of camera, and I've been using this puppy for over 4 months now, I think, and a surprising number of you have already asked me about my opinion on this particular camera, and so I'm happy to give it to you in today's video. As you can see, this is a point and shoot camera, and there are a few key giveaways like the side air vents and the included cold shoe mounted dead cat for the integrated mic, that this is primarily aimed at folks who want to use this as a compact video camera. Now usually I prefer my cameras to be photography first. The cameras that I use the most right now are my Leica M11P and the Hasselblad 907X, which do not even shoot video, and before that my main camera for 4 years plus was this Leica Q2, which does shoot video, but it's not great at it, to put it mildly. With that being said, I do have this YouTube channel, and so I do also enjoy shooting video and editing video, but for the most part when I'm out and about I want to focus on my photography, and so I want a video camera that is small and compact and lightweight, and in short does not get in the way, that doesn't take up too much space in my bag or backpack, and that is easy to use, easy to handle, and that does still put out good footage so that I can use it for my YouTube videos. Now for many years I have tried really hard to make Sony's ZV-1 cameras work for that specific purpose, but even though I'm grateful that they exist at all, and even though they are certainly capable for what they are, they never really performed in the way that I wanted them to. And that was particularly noticeable when I shot with either one of the Sony ZV-1s and one of my full frame cameras side by side, and I had footage from both cameras in my timeline, and the difference in quality was just super obvious right away. Because of that reason, towards the end of last year I bit the bullet and bought Sony's most capable yet still somewhat compact video first camera, the Sony ZV-1. This little beauty shoots 4K video at up to 120 frames per second in 10-bit and S-Log3 if you wanted to. It uses the same 12 megapixel sensor, at least to the best of my knowledge, that you would also find in the legendary Sony a7S Mark III as well as the Sony FX3. It has no EVF and sports a flip out screen and so on. It's a great piece of kit, no doubt, and especially when it's paired with a fairly compact and lightweight lens like this Tamron 20-40 f2.8, it's probably as good as it gets in terms of video capability per gram. And while I do love it for that, and I'm super happy and grateful to have it, it's just still not the same as using a really compact camera like a point and shoot sized camera. With all that in mind, when I saw that Canon had released a new point and shoot camera that was video first and sported a fairly big sensor for this type of camera, I put my order in right away. And by now I have used it for about 4 months or so, and I've also used it on a number of trips and video projects like the Tuscany vlog that I put out a few weeks or months ago. You can check it out if you like to. And so this video is not so much a video about me taking it out and doing stuff with it, because I've already done that. This is sort of a 4-month onwards review, so my personal opinion on what it's been like to use this camera over the past few months, and also how it compares to the Sony ZV-1 Mark I as well as the Mark II, because I've actually owned both of those cameras for a number of years and I've used them a lot. And I will probably also throw the odd comparison to the Sony ZV-E1, the full frame camera, in the mix as well, just for shits and giggles. And since this is YouTube, I also want to clarify that I have bought all of these cameras with my own money. I have no affiliation to Sony or Canon, and yeah, so I do not care whether you buy any of these cameras or not. This is just my opinion. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's start by talking about the size of this camera, because after all, this is a compact point and shoot camera, but if you buy this Canon V1 thinking that it would be as small as a Sony ZV-1 or the ZV-1 Mark II, you'd be in for a surprise. It's actually quite a bit bigger. Some of that is probably down to the larger sensor, some of it will be down to the heat management system inside of this camera, but overall it just ends up being a lot bigger in just about every dimension. The body itself is actually very similar in size to the Sony ZV-1, which, mind you, houses a full frame sensor and is a vastly more capable camera overall. Now granted, the Canon obviously also houses a lens, so it's an apples to oranges comparison, but still, the point here is mostly to illustrate how much bigger the Canon V1 is compared to other point-and-shoot cameras. Now, does that mean that it is too big to use? Is the size an issue? Well, I mean, that's a matter of personal preference, of course, but if you ask me, I don't think so at all. I actually think that it's great in the hand. I think that it is still just about small enough to fit into most jacket pockets. I would not put this into my pants pockets, even though it might fit depending on what kind of pants you're wearing. It also still does not take up too much space in my bag or backpack. And so again, I think that even though this camera is a lot bigger than some of its competitors, it is still very reasonably sized, and the size is absolutely not an issue overall. The comparison to the ZV-1 is also obviously kind of unfair, because as soon as you put a lens to the ZV-1, it obviously becomes a lot bigger than this puppy. And so yeah, overall, while this is a beefy boy, I think it's still a great size for this particular niche of the camera market. Let's also talk about the sensor size real quick, because the Canon V1 actually sports a bigger sensor than most of its compact point-and-shoot camera competitors, because most of them sport a 1-inch type sensor, while this sports a 1.4-inch sensor. Now, what does that mean exactly? No idea, to be honest, but from what I understand, this sensor sits somewhere in between a 1-inch type sensor and a micro four thirds sensor, but probably a lot closer to a micro four thirds sensor than to the 1-inch type sensor. Let me explain. You see, considering that Canon says that this camera has a full frame equivalent focal range of 16 to 50 millimeters, and according to the lens itself, it has a 8.2 to 25.6 millimeter lens. If you do the math, that means that this camera has a crop factor of 1.95 compared to full frame, whereas 1-inch sensors have a 2.7 times crop and micro four thirds sensors have a 2 times crop. So again, that is a lot closer to a micro four thirds sensor, and if my math is correct, actually slightly larger than a micro four thirds sensor. I'm not quite sure, I might be completely off on this. And so if you have any clue on sensor sizes and where this sits and what might be wrong about the math that I just presented to you, please let me know in the comments below. Now, be that as it may, the one thing that I am sure about is that this camera has a bigger sensor than its Sony competitors with their 1-inch type sensor. And so that should mean that you should be able to get more bokeh from your shots and better dynamic range, better low light performance, and so on and so forth. But then there is the lens. Again, it's a 16 to 50 millimeter lens in terms of full frame equivalent field of view, and we are going to talk more about the field of view later on. But at this point in time, I want to focus on the fact that this lens starts at f2.8 and stops down to f4.5 at the long end, whereas the Sony ZV-1 Mark II features an 18 to 50 millimeter full frame equivalent lens, but that lens starts at f1.8 at the wide end before it stops down to f4 at the long end. And so, while yeah, the sensor is bigger in the Canon, and it will probably still win at the long end in terms of bokeh and so on, I don't see any gains when it comes to low light performance or bokeh at the wide end compared to the ZV-1 Mark II. With that being said, we will get back to the issue of bokeh and low light performance later on in the video. But first, let's move on to colors, because one of my main gripes with those small Sony cameras were always the colors. Now, I like to shoot my footage in log just in order to maximize dynamic range, and the Sonys actually do shoot S-Log, S-Log 2 and S-Log 3, but only in 8-bit. And so because of that, it doesn't actually really make sense to shoot in S-Log2, let alone S-Log3, because it is really hard, in my experience, to put a proper grade on those 8-bit video files. Now, it is certainly possible to grade those files as well and get decent results out of them, but again, I found it really hard and I really had to put in the work. Mind you, that is absolutely not the case with the S-Log3 files that I get out of my A7 IV or the ZV-1. Those cameras, however, do shoot in 10-bit. And so this is probably the area where the Canon V1 can really pull ahead of its competitors, because it has that bigger sensor, which in and of itself usually means better dynamic range, and it does also shoot in C-Log3 and in 10-bit, and so that makes it just super easy to put a decent color grade on those files. Now, are the files out of this Canon V1 on the same level as the files that I get out of my full-frame Sony cameras? No, obviously not, but they are a lot closer, and I mean a lot closer, to those files compared to the files that I get out of the ZV-1 or the ZV-1 Mark II. And I would say that they are in fact so close to the files that I get out of my full-frame Sony cameras that to the ordinary viewer, the difference will probably not even be noticeable at all. Now, one of the most important aspects of a camera that is meant to be used for vlogging is the field of view that you get at the wide end out of a camera, and also how good the stabilization is. So in short, nobody wants to see a very close-up tight shot of your face that is all shaky, which was actually kind of the main issue with the first generation of Sony's ZV-1 cameras, because that puppy spotted a 24mm equivalent at the wide end, which was already pretty tight, but if you decided to shoot in 4K, you added another crop and then another one if you also wanted to add digital stabilization, which was desperately needed. And so you actually ended up somewhere in the neighborhood of a 28 to 30mm lens with all of the crops applied, which was just way too tight for vlogging. And the same was sort of also true for the ZV-1 Mark II. Now, while the Mark II featured an 18mm lens at the wide end, it did not have any mechanical stabilization whatsoever, and so you just had to use that digital stab, which has to come with a significant crop. And of course, it still also had a pretty noticeable 4K crop, and so even though the Mark II had a significantly wider lens, in reality it still really wasn't enough, because with all of the crops it ended up being somewhere in the neighborhood of a 22 or 24mm lens. Now, the Canon V1 on the other hand has that 16 to 50mm lens, and it has mechanical stabilization, and the 4K crop is almost unnoticeable, which means that you actually do get to use the lens with a noticeably wider field of view compared to either of its Sony competitors. And it's probably somewhere in the range of 17 or 18mm at the wide end, which I think is absolutely wide enough for vlogging. And on top of that, I have found the stabilization to be decent for the most part. Now, it's obviously not the same as having like a DJI Pocket 3, which has an integrated gimbal, so that will give you super smooth footage all of the time. But again, the stabilization that you get out of this Canon V1 is certainly very usable, at least most of the time. Because sometimes you do actually get noticeable wobbles at the wide ends, sometimes you get an overall jitter of the image for whatever reason. It's really annoying when it happens, because the footage actually becomes almost unusable. Nobody wants to see a relaxing wide shot of the Italian countryside with tons of shaking. It just ruins the vibe. As a side note, the chance of having any shakes is a lot lower when you're using both hands to shoot or any sort of small tripod grip, but sometimes that's just not convenient, and these cameras are all about convenience, so it doesn't really make sense to always have to bring other accessories in order to properly use this camera. And so in conclusion, while I still think that the Canon V1 is the best in terms of field of view and stabilization out of the three, and you also do get to use digital stabilization, which helps with the Canon, but again, that also does crop into your image, I think, again, this one's better compared to the Sonys. But if having the best stabilization is priority number one for you, I would probably still say try out the DJI Pocket 3, even though I have no first-hand experience of using that camera, so I can just go by what other people on the internet have said about that camera. But most people who own a DJI Pocket 3 seem to really love it, and so yeah. Let's come back to the point of bokeh and low light performance for a second. And in terms of bokeh, sadly, even despite the bigger sensor, honestly, there's just not a whole lot going on. Even compared to Sony's 1-inch type sensor competitors. Because where the Sony cameras sport an f1.8 aperture at the wide end, the Canon can only go down to f2.8 at the wide end. Now, the Sony ZV-1, the Mark I, actually also had mechanical stabilization, but the ZV-1 Mark II with the wider lens did not. And so that means that you had to use digital stabilization with the ZV-1 Mark II. And digital stabilization always works best if you're using a higher shutter speed. And especially in low light conditions, you are really somewhat forced to use a shutter speed that is as slow as possible. And so that inevitably means for the ZV-1 Mark II that the digital stabilization will have some issues here and there. And that is not true with the Canon V1 because again, that does have mechanical stabilization built in, and so that means that you do not have to use digital stabilization and you can just go down to 1/50th or whatever it is that you are using and still get fine stabilization and decent image quality. But with all of that out of the way, let's also go over some minor issues or advantages of the Canon V1 that I have noticed as a long-time user of those compact Sony cameras. I like that Canon sports this little switch to toggle in between photo and video mode. That is very nice. Also, the Canon is not affected by magnets. Now, this is something that for some reason no one ever seems to talk about, but if your Sony ZV-1 or ZV-1 Mark II comes in close proximity to a magnet, it will turn on, and since most electronic devices like notebooks, tablets, smartphones and even some bags have magnets in them, that just happens all of the time if you put it into your bag or backpack, and it can lead to the camera just draining the battery, but it could also, at worst, damage the lens itself when it tries to extend in a very confined space or under pressure. Now, the Sony ZV-1 has the upper hand when it comes to high frame rate shooting modes, as it can go up to 960 frames per second, which is insane, but in reality, at that frame rate, it uses an eye-bleedingly low resolution. I have honestly never touched that mode, and so I could not care less that the Canon does not have it. The Canon does, however, have the upper hand when it comes to battery life. Battery life for the smaller Sonys has always been atrocious, and while you should certainly still pack a spare battery with the Canon, I seem to get a lot more runtime out of a single charge with the Canon V1 compared to either of the Sonys. Lastly, the build quality and overall feel of the Canon is on a completely different level, especially compared to the ZV-1 Mark II. Now, the Mark II was actually a step down in that regard compared to the first gen ZV-1, and it felt almost like a toy. It's all just sort of plasticky feeling stuff, and it just looks and feels cheap. The Canon, on the other hand, feels solid in hand. It's not a Leica for sure, but it doesn't have to be. It feels appropriate for its niche and its price point. And one last thing, I don't know if I'm doing something wrong here, but for some reason, the little wind muffs for my Sony cameras, including the ZV-1 by the way, always end up looking like an absolute mess after just a few weeks. That has not been the case with the V1 so far. It's still as fluffy looking as the day it arrived. And so with all of that being said, I think that the Canon V1 right now is probably the best camera when it comes to highly compact and capable point-and-shoot cameras on the market right now. And by the way, it is also actually quite a capable little camera when it comes to photography, but again, I mostly use this to record video, and so that's not something that I felt qualified to talk about in this video. Now, even though it is, in my opinion, a better camera than its Sony competitors, it's also quite a bit more expensive, and at that price point you can actually get a more serious camera if you like. And if this is your only camera and the compact size actually isn't that much of a priority for you, you probably also should look into other solutions for your sort of entry-level camera. However, if what you're looking for is just that, the most compact setup with the best image quality for any type of money, essentially, I think this is a camera for you. However, as I said earlier, even though it is the best camera in its niche right now, I still think that there are areas for improvements for Canon for the next iteration, and I do hope that there will be a next iteration. Faster lens, especially at the wide end, and also better stabilization. And also I would love for them to include some 4K high frame rate modes like 4K 60, maybe 4K 120 at some point. I mean, it does have those heat vents and cooling, and so yeah, maybe that's an option in the future. But anyway, that's all I got for you today. I hope this was interesting. I hope this was informative if you are in a market for either of those cameras. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments down below, and I will see you in another video. Until then, take good care. Bye.